It's time to take a step beyond. The podcast to inspire creativity and imagination. Here's your host, Dr. Anthony Poston.
Thanks for tuning in to A Step Beyond. If you've been listening to this show, then you know I frequently write about leadership and often apply some lessons learned from the Apollo Moon program during the 1960s. You know, we all know that some people believe the entire Apollo program was a hoax and staged in some Hollywood studio. However, I honestly think the reason why people believe this is because the program was nothing short of extraordinary during an extremely difficult decade in this country's history. It was a time when NASA had a huge budget, about 5% of the total federal budget, a massive workforce. Based on 1969 census data, about 1 in 150 workers in this country worked on Apollo in some way. Some of the greatest orchestrated creativity and imagination the world has ever seen, and of course, extraordinary people doing extraordinary things. One of those extraordinary people is with us today. He's an engineer and former NASA test pilot. However, his most memorable role was that of the lunar module pilot for the infamous Apollo 13 mission. And if you saw the movie, he was played by the late Bill Paxton. Ladies and gentlemen, Fred Haise. Fred, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon.
So before we get into Apollo 13, let's talk a bit about how you got there in the first place. I believe you actually started your first couple of years of college as a journalism major. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. I'd gotten interested in the newspaper business, so to speak, when I was in high school, working on the high school Biloxi, Mississippi high school newspaper, and that sort of struck me as a good thing to do as I went on, grew up, and was going to go in a career, and so that's what I aimed for, was to be a journalist ultimately.
Okay, but that obviously did not happen. You found a way. You kind of stumbled your way into the Naval Aviation Program. Talk about how you got there and how all that transpired.
Okay. It was accidental because I had never been interested in aviation. Never been around airplanes or even in an airplane sitting on the ground. And I did want to serve in the Korean War. My dad, two uncles, in fact, one died in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II, had been in the military during World War II, and I was interested in serving my country. And I looked around, and at the age I was at, 18, with 2 years of college, I graduated from high school at 16. But at that age, there was only one program that could lead me to become a commissioned officer, which my dad had always recommended if I went in the military to strive to get in a program that would get me a commission. He actually wanted me to go in the nuclear submarines, if you can believe it or not. But the only program that fit that age and 2 years of college was the Naval Aviation Cadet Program. So being an 18-year-old, there's a lot of things you jump into without thinking too much about, and it was amazing, though. The first time I flew, it was just like a magical event, and I knew my passion was there to make this now my new career, something in aviation. I wasn't quite sure what it was going to be, but journalism kind of went by the wayside.
Well, it's amazing because I talk to tons of people, and it always impresses me and amazes me how a lot of these people have just something that occurred in their life. It wasn't even planned, or it wasn't even an intentional activity. It just happened, and next thing you know, you're going to school to be a journalist, to work in a newspaper, and the long story or the short of it is you finally end up going from there to naval aviation school. You become a pilot in an aircraft that you've never ever even flown before in anything. You've never flown, period. You jump from that to the NASA test pilot program, and then next thing you know, you're on your way to the moon, which is incredible to me because that was such an unintentional path when you first start out on that, and how things just occur in life. It just the spontaneous achievement, so to speak, that happens. I'm sure many of our listeners have seen the movie Apollo 13, but that's Hollywood. You were, in fact, there. So take us through the moments up to the explosion and then what happened right after it occurred.
Well, the mission up to the point of the explosion, about 2 days out, as we were actually near the end of a workday, fixing to go to bed, had just completed a TV show, sort of a show and tell thing we did, and we're fixing to go to bed and rest up and get up the next morning and go into lunar orbit and prepare to go land on the moon. And when this event happened, the mission had been pretty normal, I should say, up to that time. We did lose a center engine on the second stage 2 minutes early on the way uphill on launch, but that really didn't cause any other problems. There was enough fuel. It ran a little longer, the second stage, and then took a little more fuel out of the third stage, but basically didn't impact the mission. Now, this explosion happened, I was still in the lunar module where Jim Lovell and I had staged it, and I was putting away equipment we had pulled out for this show and tell kind of thing we did. We brought equipment out to discuss that we knew people had not heard about in previous TV shows, and I was putting the stuff back away that I'd taken out of storage when the explosion happened. It was a loud bang that ricocheted, reverberated through the structure these vehicles were in. Both of them are metal. And sort of like you're in a big 50-gallon drum, and somebody pounded on the outside with a sledgehammer. And so you had that just momentary sound like that. A little bit of vehicle motion, nothing like in the movie. And you could hear the small attitude rocket engines firing, trying to hold attitude. Jim Lovell had started to drift up through the tunnel that led him back into the command module. Jack Swigert was all alone at that time in the command module. And he made the first call back to Houston that Houston had a problem. They did not answer, and when Jim got in position, he made the call again. Second time, Houston would have had a problem. I then followed shortly, drifting up through the tunnel. And the instant I call it emotion for me was looking over the instrument panel, and in particular knowing what had happened probably was not normal and probably something bad. But scanning the panel, it was obvious from certain meter readings in several instruments that we had lost oxygen tank 2. And so I was just sick to my stomach with disappointment, because without the reference of the mission rules document, I knew that meant an abort, and we would not even be able to go into lunar orbit, much less land. So we had basically lost the landing mission within the first minute I looked at the instrument panel. It was not life-threatening because it appeared that the second tank, oxygen tank 1, was still intact. And so what would have happened if that had continued, we would have stayed fully powered up and had just done an abort of one sort or another to come home with everything fully powered up. So that was the circumstances at that point. Now, after some time, in fact, 18 minutes, Mission Control did not believe this was a real problem. They thought it was instrumentation, because what was also going on with, and I on board, we were seeing caution and warning, crossing several systems. These are warning lights, some red, some orange, yellow, that indicate when something's not right. And the systems that the lights were on for were not interconnected through, like most vehicles today, modern fighters or bombers or transports even. They're all coupled through a central computer processor. And in our case, the vehicles were very simple. We didn't have much computing power. And so the computer did not do much except guidance, nav, and control. All the other systems were manual and were totally isolated from each other. So it did make sense that these readings of warnings and caution lights of something going wrong were crossing about 4 or 5 different systems. And that, like I said, that also confused us on board, but also confused Mission Control for that length of time. Now, Jim Lovell did report seeing the something going away from the spacecraft, and I guess that was the leak out of oxygen tank 1 that became apparent just the way the spacecraft had turned, and it was shining in the sunlight that went through the oxygen that was being depleted. It was clearly seen then by Jim, and he reported that. So that's when sort of everybody got on board that we had a real problem to deal with.
You know, the movie makes it sound like that the moon landing per se, or the actual touchdown per se, wasn't called until Mission Control asked you guys to close the react valves. But you're telling me that you already knew it was off the table. You knew based on what you saw that it was a done deal long before Mission Control said anything about it. Yes,
no, I knew within the first minute when I scanned the instrument panel, because the things that the oxygen tank, cryo system, fuel cells, electric power, some of the environmental stuff, and some of the communication was all on my side of the command module, the right couch position. So when I looked across there and saw those readings, it was obvious we'd lost one of the 2 oxygen tanks we had.
Yeah, because in the movie, Jim Lovell keeps saying, "Are you sure you want?" Because he played this whole drama thing about we just lost the moon kind of thing. So let me ask you a question. So you have all these sounds banging. You're seeing things. The lights are all going crazy. I'm sure in your mind that you were actively busy trying to figure out things. You just said you knew the moon was gone off the table. Were you concerned at all at that point about maybe never getting back? I mean, did it even occur to you that you might not get back at that time?
No, it was not until slowly it became apparent the second oxygen tank was leaking. Then that put it in a whole different category. But it still wasn't like it was imminent, like thing didn't blow up like the other one. And we had hopes of stopping the leak, and that's what went on then for over an hour. People on the ground, the right system people were, and later I listened to their inner loop channels in Mission Control, which is not public, and they were professionally arguing about what should we do next to try to stop this leak. And they passed up procedures to us to do things that they hoped would stop the leak. So, the game wasn't lost for over an hour. And that's when it was obvious that they had run out of ideas. And by that time, Jim had already sent me into the lunar module to start powering it up. Because, of course, when that tank and that was fed the fuel cell, the only fuel cell remaining, we only had one left. When that one died from lack of oxygen, then we'd lose all electric power in the command and service module, except for the 3 small batteries that were there for entry. That we couldn't deplete those. So it was obvious that we're going to have to shut that vehicle down. So Jim sent me to get the LEM, get it cranked up, so we'd have communication and environmental systems and communications to carry on the fight.
So my understanding is, I was talking to Alan Bean some time ago, and he told me that, like, for example, using your mission as an example, we talked about mission rules and training for contingencies. He had mentioned that you guys had already had a contingency plan in place to use the lunar module as a lifeboat in the event something happened. Correct?
Well, that was a concept. There was a so I'll call it that, a big picture concept that the lunar module was there, and if it was not utilized, it would be there to use for a lifeboat to keep you alive. No one, I don't think, considered in concert with the command module being completely shut down and having to do what the LEM ended up having to do.
Yeah.
No, nothing. There was nothing to that extent. So most of the I'll call it workaround procedures and things that went on that people had to, a lot of people actually, a lot more than in the movie, had to work and figure out what to do next. Was not, that was strict. That did not exist. None of those procedures.
NASA is famous for doing such a fantastic job with its contingency thinking, coming through all the possible scenarios of what might happen, but you can't cover them all because there are just things that you just can't possibly imagine could ever happen. And this is probably one of them.
The command module, command and service module, we called, colloquially, we called it the mothership because it was never, ever supposed to be shut down. It was never planned to be shut down. It was never tested to be ever shut down in testing with that vehicle.
So
we were on unfamiliar ground for that vehicle, at least in terms of its total design development. And if turn it off for 4 days, it turned out, and let it freeze for that length of time. So it was, another aspect of that. When it came time to power it up, a big effort they had worked on for, I think, about 2.5 days, they had to also develop a procedure how to turn it back on. Because since it was never meant to be powered off in flight, we had no procedure on how to turn the thing on.
So
that was a major task that people on the ground had to wrestle with over those few days. And that was not... Obviously, that was not portrayed in the movie and I even talked about because it didn't fit media well and would have probably been hard for people to understand. But that was one of the major things that had to be worked on during that time was how to power that thing back up.
So this all began because, you had to stir the tanks. And that was a famous kind of thing that came out of the movie, What does that mean to the person who's listening right now who has no idea what that is? Explain why you stir the tanks and what that is.
Okay, the liquid oxygen and hydrogen tanks in cryogenics, very cold. If you sit around in 0G like we were, the fluid in there tends to stratify in layers, if you will. And so there's heaters in there that tend to boil some off when you want to use it to turn it to gaseous type, but there's mixers, a little egg beater, if you want to just think of it, that is turned on, and that's when you stir the cryos, and that's to mix it up. So you take away that stratification, and that then allows people on the ground to get a more accurate quantity reading. So that's the purpose of stirring the cryos. Not all the time, but occasionally when they want a good quantity reading.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about you mentioned water, and you mentioned how things were frozen up and how you had to shut the command module off, and you weren't sure how to turn it back on again. And water, my understanding with the fuel cells and the way they worked on Apollo, that water was a byproduct of the fuel cells. That that when the fuel cells generated power, the byproduct is water, right? And you guys could even drink this water. It's
virtually electrolysis in reverse. Right. You mix the hydrogen and oxygen, which through a catalytic converter, and that gives you electric power. And the byproduct is water. It's fairly pure water too.
So, if your fuel cells weren't working and producing water, did you have to ration water big time on the voyage there and back?
No. The LEM had descent and ascent in both halves of the vehicle. The LEM had water plenty for us to drink. So there was no water rationing per se. Although in general, as a tendency, and that's you're kind of pre-briefed that before missions, and I assume that's true today. Just because you're not doing heavy workload, sitting around in 0G, and that may be part of it or whatever, but you tend not to drink as much as you would normally drink on Earth, just by the nature of the environment. And so they kind of coach you before you leave to try to drink water, as often as you can think about it, so you don't get dehydrated. But no, we had no water shortage at all to worry about.
Yeah, because the movie kind of led the viewer to believe that you guys were rationing water and you got ill, and I believe you had was it a kidney or urinary tract infection or something during that?
I did. I had a lower urinary tract infection, and it primarily was because I was lazy, and rather than worry about storing the urine the way the others were doing it, I found an old, what we call a Gemini bag, On Gemini, they wore this little receptacle. It was like a prophylactic you slipped on, and you could urinate right into this bag. And I was using that, and I just left it on. And till the next time I had to go to the bathroom. And, of course, what happens then is some urine doesn't all go through the check valve, and you end up with your appendage bathed in urine and with germs. And so they were traveled up my system, and that's how I ended up with that lower urinary tract infection.
Okay, so let's go back to water. So the command module was frozen. You had to fire it back up again. So there was moisture, right, all over the inside of the command module once it unfroze?
Right. Both vehicles, actually. The power levels we went down to in the lunar module and temperature that resulted, it was not quite freezing temperature in the lunar module because its water tanks did not freeze. But the command module, the water tanks froze. They were actually found frozen when the vehicle was recovered on board the aircraft carrier.
And that was after
they checked it out.
And that was after a fiery, yeah.
But at that temperature, you have part of the system is a water separator, because you breathe every time you breathe in out, you breathe out moisture, and so there's a water separator that's working, and both vehicles had them, that normally would take care of any excess moisture that was building up. In our case, at that temperature, we were well below the design for the LEM water separator, and of course, in the command module, there was nothing working. So water tended to just, the excess perspiration and by breathing out moisture started collecting over everything, over the walls, and we could see it in the LEM around the inner walls because they were visible. There was no inner wall in the LEM. It was just netting material to kind of keep you from bumping into power lines or plumbing. And you could look behind there and see the water, and at every turn of the line, there'd be a globule of water sitting there. And the same in the command module, when Jack and I, we powered it up, got in there, we had to get out a towel to wipe off the instrument panel to see the instruments that were just covered with water. And, of course, we knew there was probably similarly a lot of water behind the panels where a lot of the wiring was. So that was a sort of a concern at that time.
Well, I believe I heard you say once how you think that Apollo 1 may have actually helped save you in this case because of what happened. And talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, Apollo 1, for those that don't recall, it was where we did lose a crew on the launch pad, preparing in a sort of a test exercise that was going to lead up in a few days to actually launch on the very first mission. And they suffered an electric short, and they had a different kind of hatch than we ended up with. That was one of the byproducts of the accident investigation. They couldn't get out. They were trapped, in essence, and were all killed by the ensuing fire in this highly combustible, pure oxygen atmosphere. So as a result of that accident, though, there were many, many fixes that, as most accidents, aircraft accidents or spacecraft in this case, byproduct of the accident investigation is to say what you're going to do different to make sure it doesn't happen again. And that leads to changes. In this case, the hatch completely was redesigned on the spacecraft, but there was extensive work on the wiring, and both not just the wiring itself, but how it was hermetically sealed differently with a special compound at all the connectors. So that was done not just in the command module, but that was also implemented in the lunar modules. So that, as I say, probably saved us because there was water. All of both spacecraft had extensive water on the walls and around wiring bundles and the connector interfaces, and so I think it was a result of that very careful rework that was done after Apollo 1 that saved us from having maybe a similar electric short of some type, and of course we were in the same atmosphere, 100% oxygen.
You know, subsequent missions always learned lessons from prior missions. So what do you think the missions that occurred after yours learned from your mission and your experience?
I'm not sure anything that we did directly applied just to from the oxygen tank itself and the problem with the cryos and the egg beater and the heaters. One thing that was changed just because of the circumstances and difference in the vehicle and the missions they flew. Space Shuttle, for instance, does not have those egg beaters, so you don't stir the cryos in the command module. I mean the Space Shuttle. Primarily because as it does its work, what it normally does, going in orbit and around in orbit, doing its mission, it fires the thrusters for attitude or changing attitude often enough that in itself stirs the cryos. So from that motion, so there were no egg beaters, so to speak, in subsequent spacecraft. There's still heaters. You have to have still heaters in that wiring. Because, like I said, the liquid oxygen and hydrogen are very cold, and they have to be heated to convert some of it into gaseous quantity to be utilized, really, by systems.
Well, I think I heard you once say that one of the lessons learned was, unlike, say, military aircraft, which I dealt with in the Air Force as well, that you had redundant systems on both sides of the aircraft, and versus your spacecraft, which had everything on one side all packaged together, so when it blew, it affected everything simultaneously. Right. Yeah. Didn't you mention that they had moved tanks to opposite sides?
You're absolutely correct. That was one fallacy, because when one tank went, it influenced the other tank. But no, what they did was they added another oxygen tank for Apollo 14 and subsequent vehicles, and they did put it on the opposite side. So yeah, those modifications were made. They also added a LEM, I think, entry battery. I'm not sure it was one or two. I think one. So one entry battery, which is the bigger battery in the LEM, that was added to the service module. So they still could have it, even if all the fuel cells went for some length of time, they could have access to battery power to run the service module part of the command and service module.
Okay, so an oxygen tank exploded, but that wasn't your biggest problem, obviously, and which I think I've heard you say in the past, at the time it all happened, you didn't even think about what your biggest problem was going to be, and that came later, and that was obviously the carbon dioxide buildup. Take us through how you solved that, because and the reason why I asked this question is it amazes me that the part that nobody ever really talks about much is, and I recently wrote about this in an article, is the fact that while NASA, while people through mission control and engineers, et cetera, on the ground were trying to figure out how to convert, basically put a square peg in a round hole, and how to convert the square cartridge into a round cartridge and everything else, and they had to explain to you guys how to build that thing. It was a fact that you guys were able to effectively build that through radio instruction. And the reason why I say it's amazing is because I do a simple exercise in my college classes I've taught over the decades, which I had two students sit back-to-back with giant Legos in front of each student, the exact same sets, and I had one student build something, and I had to have the other student explain to the student behind them how to build it, and they couldn't, and never could they effectively do that. I mean, so the fact that you guys were able to do that is what amazes me more than anything else about that. So take us to that process a little bit.
No, you did bring up a very good point. Incidentally, I was not involved, unlike the movie, which had me ripping the bag or something. I was off duty. For 2 days, the way we worked was I was always on alone, and then Jack and Jim were on. So we cycled that way. So I was not awake when they got that procedure, and was not involved with the building of that workaround. To use a square cartridge, so to speak, in the round hole in the LEM. But no, I think that's because of just the nature of our FAOs and our call it meticulous way procedures in flight vernacular are developed and written. And see, I think it would have been easier for the students if the guy would have given the other guy a step-by-step meticulous written script. He might have done better with the Legos. And that's basically what we got. I mean, Jim and Jack got They got a step-by-step procedure on how to do that.
Well,
and you just follow the yellow brick road.
Well, I got to tell you,
most of our procedures are that way. And very carefully when you're executing these, if they're really critical, you do a check and balance. I mean, one guy normally doesn't do it; the other guy's looking over the shoulder and verifying each step. If it's not super time critical. So that's the way that kind of business is managed.
Well, I got to tell you, the fact that the fuel, space is so cold, and the fact that the tanks were still frozen when they put recovered the capsule onto the carrier, and after going through the fiery reentry, think with the heat shield and how much temperature increase there was on that, and it's still frozen, amazes me. So, okay, people go to the moon. And I'm convinced the reason why we went to the moon is because the only real way to experience something is through direct human interaction, no matter what that is. Since I or my listeners will not get to go ever, or at least yet, who knows, I'd like to hear your thoughts on some of the experiences that you had, if you don't mind. Like, first, take us through what a launch was like on top of that giant 363-foot tall Saturn rocket, which is massive.
Well, first of all, I have to say you have to consider my background, or virtually the background of just about everybody of that day and age in the program. We were all military pilots. I'd been in 2 Marine fighter squadrons before becoming a NASA test pilot for 7 years. And so that was kind of my background. And in a very similar way, most of the other people that flew then in that time period had a similar background and a set of experiences. So the ride itself on the Saturn, the big Saturn, there weren't too many what I call surprises from the standpoint of things I'd experienced in airplanes. For instance, the G levels were fairly modest. That first stage got to the highest G level, and at burnout it was like at 4.5 Gs. Fighter airplanes, I flew even the older fighters I was in then. In combat maneuvering training, we would pull 6 or 7 Gs. And in a much worse position, taking those Gs, sitting upright in an ejection seat versus laying on your back in a couch. Gs were harder to take, if you will. So that part was kind of, a novelty, obviously. 4.5 Gs is an experience, but it certainly wasn't anything beyond what I had done in airplanes. And the centrifuges, I've actually rode out in a centrifuge to about 12 Gs. This thing whirls you around a room and fast, and you get the G levels up that way. So I'd been up to 12 Gs in centrifuge. So that wasn't too much of a surprise. The only motion that was unusual was the left to right motion. When the big engines, the 4 outer engines on the Saturn V first stage move, and they gimbal to keep you steered in the right direction. I guess moving that much thrust, even a very small degree, creates quite a bit of enough motion that's and somewhat magnified, because we sat in the little capsule right up on the tippy top of all of that. And so you got a lot of herky-jerky motion, but mostly unusual from an airplane was the left-to-right motion, side to side. You don't get much of that in an airplane. You've been in airplanes where you feel turbulence, but it's mostly sort of up and down, whereas it was quite a bit of left to right, which was unusual compared to an airplane experience. The only kind of real surprise was when the first stage shut down, when those engines... The center one actually was shut down a little early to maintain the Gs at a max of about 4.5. But the 4 outer ones had shut down simultaneously, and that was just like, they kind of exaggerated a little bit in the movie, but showing them getting thrown into the instrument panel. But you almost felt like that would have happened had you not been tightly strapped in. It was very abrupt to go from 4.5 Gs to nothing that quickly. The rest of the ride was pretty straightforward, even less smoother and less academic compared to airplane experience. The first engine I mentioned went out in the second stage, had a little bit of vibration with it. We were encountered pogo. It's a fluid feed dynamic that actually changes thrust level in the engines, and then in that center engine particularly had, I call it chugging almost, but it gave you sort of a jackhammer, small, very low level sensation of being on a jackhammer doing a little buzz kind of sequence. And that went away very quickly, though, when the engine shut down. Well, automatically, it was meant to shut down for that circumstance. But that was about it. So there really wasn't too many surprises. The two biggest surprises from all my aviation experience in being in space was the views out the window. Of course, they're incredible. At times, looking at even from low Earth orbit, where we were for a couple of turns around, but obviously out to the moon and around the moon, even the brief passage, where it's hard to believe you're looking out the window. I'm really here looking at this. So that's one of the things that's, and people on space station talk about the views and the things they see. Just are really impressive. And the other thing, of course, is zero gravity. Being able to float yourself or float objects is kind of euphoric, and obviously an experience you can only get by being in space. So that was the other unique thing, I'll call it, about flying a space flight was that aspect.
So did the overall experience change you at all?
Did the overall experience do? I'm sorry? Did
the overall experience change you at all?
No. No, to me, the whole mission was just another great adventure. The moon, if you think of it in the big picture, and I'd studied astronomy just out of curiosity when I was in high school, enough to realize how vast the universe is that we're a little piece of here. So, going to the moon struck me as not going very far, which is true. I mean, if you think of it in the big picture, it's a little baby step of really going out there. So no, it was obvious. In fact, I gave a picture of the flight afterwards, and when I went back to NASA Flight Research Center afterwards visiting, and I gave them a picture of the out about the moon, I think it was, I picked, and I wrote on it just another altitude flight and signed my name. Going to the moon to me was just had an altimeter, need to read a little higher, but that's basically what we did. We just went out and looped around the moon and came back.
Well, I know your lives were totally engulfed by all your training and the entire experience of it all, the after stuff you had to deal with. Did any of this take a toll on your personal life?
It did. We definitely since then. Everything we did in Apollo, with very few exceptions, the little water tank work we did, the zero-G airplane, and an old boilerplate where they towed us out in the Gulf and we practiced like we had just splashed down, that kind of thing. Everything else we did wasn't where we lived. Spacecraft testing was at the plants, either in California or New York or Kennedy Space Center when they arrived there. All our primary simulators were at Kennedy Space Center, all our mission simulators that we spent thousands of hours in. And, of course, the field geology, they're trying to make us good field geologists, that was wherever. I mean, Hawaii, I've been Iceland, you name it, Sudbury in Canada, all across the southwest U.S. So all those trips for field geology training were away from home. So, and the training, particularly through Apollo 11, I trained for 8 and 11. I was the backup on both, where you train equally with the prime. I mean, you just split half days normally what you're doing. You just very seldom got home at all to change your clothes a little bit and maybe have a day or day and a half to visit before you're on the road again. And of course, both of those got very intense in about the last 2 months, 6 weeks. It almost went to like 7 days a week, to meetings to 10 at night. So that was the kind of thing, and it loosened up for 13. Even the launch schedule started moving out a little bit. First with 12, and then we had a little more relaxed time. But invariably, always that last month, 6 weeks, you ended up in that tight corner to feel you got to get everything done. And I trained the fourth one I trained for was Apollo 16, and that was even more relaxed in terms of time frame that took. So no, it was very hard of not being home. I think harder on my wife because I had been military Marine Corps and I'd never really gone on long deployments. I had one 6-week deployment, I think, on a weapons exercise down to Puerto Rico, but unlike others, like Jim Lowell's in Navy, he had been on ship deployments, aircraft carriers out, gone from home for 6-9 months at a time. And so I think the military wives that had that experience were better suited to live with the kind of existence we had during that period.
Well, I know you were originally slated to be the commander for Apollo 19, which was canceled because of budget cuts. So then you transitioned into the Shuttle program, and you got to command one of the first two-man crews that tested how the space shuttle would glide in and land. This is before it actually went out into space. You flew the Enterprise, which, of course, I have to laugh as a Trekkie because it makes me smile. But you were, and as an NASA test pilot, you were basically flying experimental aircraft because the shuttle was still experimental at that point. I mean, we hadn't done anything with it. We hadn't flown it yet. So, and my understanding was, I mean, you kind of had to dead stick that in, right? It's like a flying brick. Because my Air Force background, we used to call the F-4 a flying brick, and my time flying in the F-4 was like a flying brick because they had little wingspan and everything else. Take us through that experience, what that was like, because it was air launched from a 747, right?
Yeah, we had a carrier aircraft that was used a lot later to ferry the orbiters back to Kennedy when they landed at Edwards. PAC-1 landed at White Sands, the third shuttle flight, and they had to cart it back to Kennedy for the next launch. But no, that was not a flying brick. The shuttle, kind of a parameter that describes the performance characteristics of a glider, which the shuttle is when it's coming back in. It's called L over D, lift to drag. And to put that in a context of the shuttle basically was roughly the same lift to drag glider capability as the X-15 rocket ship.
Oh, okay.
About 4.5.
Yeah.
If you had a good sports gliders, some of them are up, I think, in the 50s and 60s. So, there's quite a range. I'm not sure what a DC-9 or an airliner would be, but it's probably up in the 15 to 20 at least range, and better maybe even. So it's not obviously not a super good glider, but it's not a brick either. We flew well. First of all, I flew on ground tow the first lifting body. This is the vehicles that were later for test. There was 3 versions of it built, and some variations of those at Edwards, 2 NASA and 1 Air Force. The first one, the M2 F1 and M2 F2, were basically an LVD of a little over 2.45, I think. The flat bottom HL10 was about 3, a little over. Now, the Air Force had the best one. They had one with a little wider body to give a little more body lift. It got up, I think, close to 4. So there were vehicles that were flown at Edwards, and we flew a test program with an F-5D, the big brother of the Sky Raider F-4D, that had variable speed brakes that came out of the wings, top and bottom, and we've scabbed on extra plate on that to create more drag, beefed up the landing gear, attached structure to handle 320 knots, and had a switch we could pop open the nozzles on the afterburner to produce, in essence, about 600 pounds reverse thrust at idle. So in doing all of that, we flew that vehicle in a test program down to an LOVD of 1, which basically is landing out of a 45-degree dive angle. So, and Bill Dana actually flew that, carried it on and flew a night program at Edwards Air Force Base using full moon initially, and worked down about half a moon. He said it got kind of hairy. So then we went to flares that we dropped out of a RC-47 Goonie bird on both sides of the lake bed that basically lit up the lake bed at Edwards. So it was kind of like a day landing, which is now the way with xenon lamps, the way they land shuttles when they landed at night. So no, it's not a flying brick. It's not a super glider, but it's not out of hand. It does require some getting used to it, and that's why they have the shuttle training aircraft. For people who have not been involved that way before, and what we call high energy approaches, we did at Edwards. They gave them indoctrination to be able to do that.
Fred, you mentioned you were on the backup crews for Apollo 8 and Apollo 11. We're getting ready to celebrate the 50th anniversaries of both of those, Apollo 8 this December and Apollo 11 next July. On Apollo 13, it's kind of like you took a 1-week vacation and have been talking about it for almost a half century now. Do you ever get tired of talking about it?
No, not really. I'm frankly intrigued and obviously very happy that I find people still interested. I mean, that's the thing that's amazing to me. It's been a long time ago.
Well, I don't know how they couldn't be interested.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect to. And it's not just space geeks. I mean, like at Space Fest or things I go to like that. I mean, it's. I've talked to Bankers of America. I mean, I've given a lot of talks to about every variety audience you can think of, and they all are very interested. So I find that intriguing in a way, and certainly hard to imagine that'd be just so interested after so long a time.
So if you couldn't have been a pilot or an astronaut and had to do something different in life, what do you think that would have been?
Offhand, that right now I can't think. Obviously, journalism, unfortunately, has not turned out the way I'd hoped it would. Newspaper business, is struggling right now.
Oh,
to
yeah,
some degree.
Yeah.
You media guys have overtaken the paper newspaper in many ways.
Well, I do still read it myself.
Yeah. And but I found that very interesting. I did a lot of feature stuff, not just sports. I was sports editor for a couple of years, editor of the junior college paper. But I also did a lot of feature stuff in the summers. I worked for the local newspaper, doing what basically you're doing. I'd be speakers at some of the local hotels in Biloxi, Mississippi, and I'd go interview some of the speakers, that were going to be there for the conference or whatever. I found it interesting. You met a lot of people, and you had to do a little homework to try to understand the background of what the subjects were going to be and what you might ask, that kind of thing. So it still was interesting business to me.
Well, speaking of business, space is changing. We have the commercial side now with SpaceX, Blue Origin, and a number of different ones. Where do you think, just kind of a gut reaction, where do you think we'll be in 20 years when it comes to space travel?
It's hard to say. I could say where I'd like it to be, but where it's going to be is strictly based on space policy and what will be funded by the powers to be, and be it here or Russia or China or wherever, of where it'll go and how far it'll go. We're obviously not, in my view, we're not putting a lot into, as much as we should be, into basic research, particularly in propulsion area. Because we're other than the things people talk about just within our solar system, even that still seems to be a difficult thing to do. You're not going very far unless you do something different than what's going to get you there, mainly propulsion, further out, certainly. And we're not doing anything much in that direction by anybody. And so those kind of things are what will drive it as to how far you can go and how quickly you can go. Now, I'm not talking about something like warp drive or, which I'd hope maybe they couldn't invent, but nothing that exotic, but certainly better than what we have.
So,
and the propulsion systems.
Right. So let me ask you, I mean, when you saw the Falcon Heavy take off a while back, the first launch of the Falcon Heavy from SpaceX, did you have any thoughts on that when you saw that, or any feelings about that?
No, I'm amazed. I'm amazed the number of engines they use in that scheme.
Oh yes, many.
And that's probably the biggest difference I've seen in their call it. And I don't know any details of the design, but that's different. Which seems to be working fine, and they have obviously engine out capability better that way. And I'm particularly impressed with the fact they can land the thing. Now you have to realize in Shuttle, in the Phase A, where you're kind of doing concepts before you got more seriously into the design, in Phase B, before you let out the proposals, RFP for people to bid to build it. We had a flyback booster. That was one of the schemes on Shuttle. And it was obviously going to be manned. Now, if you did it today, it would be unmanned. But nevertheless, we had a flyback booster. But the trades very quickly said that was going to cost enough that probably it was not floatable. And a lot of programs are that way. You almost have to build a number that is you think will be passable through administration and Congress to go do it. So you kind of get backed into a bogey, if you will. And I've never been on the inside of the head shed to understand how exactly they do that backdoor, but that's kind of the way some the programs evolve. Is what can we think we can afford to lay on and get done now? And so the flyback booster went away in Phase A. No, I think it was a miss. Incidentally, just to correct one thing, I know there was some discussion. Neil Armstrong, I think, and Gene Cernan and Jim Lovell all appeared before Congress on that spawning of the commercial business, and it got misread. I think that they were against it, against commercial ventures. What they were arguing with, and somehow the media lost that thread. They were kind of against the fact that the early several $1 billion that NASA had to float to help them get started, NASA virtually had to eat. In other words, they did not increase NASA's budget by that amount. And so that was the complaint. If you understand what I mean.
Oh, yeah. And not only that, but NASA's budget today is pretty pathetic in comparison to what...
Right. Now, taking that amount of money out of the budget, say, well, I'm sorry, you can't spend that on what you might have wanted to. You got to fund these commercial ventures. That was... And, of course, NASA can't complain too much themselves. So that was the point I think Neil and Gene Cernan and Lovell were trying to make. And like I said, it got somehow misinterpreted, and the media said they were all against commercials. No, the mission that at least where they're headed with the commercial business is certainly absolutely valid. I mean, NASA should not be the truck driver to get stuff up and down, people or supplies, and like they're planning to do, or even satellites and things. NASA's mission ought to be exploration, period, and manned or unmanned. That's ought to be kind of their number one code and mission statement. And so, no, the commercial business is certainly valid.
Well, that's a very good point about NASA not being the truck driver. And I still can't believe that you think the media, how dare they get something wrong? They never get anything wrong. I'm just kidding. Hey, Fred, I want to thank you for taking some time with me today. Let me end the show by asking you this. This podcast is all about and nothing more than inspiring people of all ages to become the best version of he or she self, or his or herself. If you were speaking to a large audience of young people, college students, whatever, what would you say to help inspire them to something greater?
I don't really have a statement that will inspire them. The hope is they will be inspired by various mentors that they have through their life, their parents, clergy, their employees, managers, supervisors, whatever, and that things like museums, which I've worked with over the years and continue to, which I think can trigger things and inspire people and interest. But the primary thing I emphasize on them is to try to work hard on understanding the inherent talent that you're born with, which we all are born with talent, and it's now how to best figure out what that talent is and how to best marry it with a profession that it will be best used. And if you do that, I tell people that you're going to find that when you lay out the goals and that goal and where you want to head and what it takes to get there, be it training of some sort or further education, you would find by primarily using that kind of talent you're blessed with, you would find the journey easier, more fun, even the hard work you might have to do getting through schools or training or whatever. You'll find most of that a lot of fun and enjoyment. You'll do better. And similarly, when you get out into the profession, into the field, you'll generally find that, not every day, but most days you want to go to work, you're happy to go to work, look forward to it, and it'll be fun and exciting, and you'll, same way, generally have a happier and more fruitful and be more successful in your life, your professional life.
Well, thanks again, Fredo. You had an amazing experience that only a few other people got to share. And thank all of you for listening and taking a step beyond with us. The Apollo program, in my opinion, is one of the greatest examples of orchestrated creativity and applied imagination. It shows that with enough effort and resources, pretty much anything is possible. As I said before, there are thousands of products and innovations today we all take for granted that came directly out of the research created for Apollo, and by some estimates, the economic return on investment was as high as 15-1. I challenge anyone to find another return like that, especially in the public sector. Through Apollo, imagination and creativity were combined with passion and hard work, a recipe for greatness. I hope you'll continue to listen to A Step Beyond and become inspired to be the very best version of yourself. I'm your host, Anthony Postian. Follow your dreams.
Thanks for listening to A Step Beyond. Take a moment, if you would, and leave a review on iTunes and share the podcast with those who need to be inspired to become more creative and imaginative in everything they do.